Welcome back, boils and ghouls. You are not lost, you're just off the beaten rack. Now, tonight we're going to be talking about Kirby and Lee Stuf Said, specifically the second expanded edition, which came out in October of 2019. It was released by Tomorrow's Publishing and written by publisher and founder John Morrow. This book is basically quotes from Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, starting in the 1940s and leading up until their deaths in 1994 and 2018, respectively. John Morrow claims to be trying to impartially look at who created what when and how Jack Kirby and Stan Lee's personal relationship and altering accounts of things led to several of the greatest battles in comic book history. He kind of is, but even in the introduction, Morrow has to openly admit he first finished the book in 2004 in the wake of having to testify in several enormous lawsuits between the Kirby estate and Marvel Comics. Not Jack Kirby, the Kirby estate. Jack Kirby never sued Marvel Comics. Don't get me started on this. So the information here is exhaustive. It's insanely detailed, and it delves deeper than any other book on the material that I'm aware of. And it goes into the saga of the birth of the Marvel era of comic books. It is rather unfortunate that the author is so stilted in Kirby's direction, and he really is. Even if John Morrow tries to be impartial, and I personally tend to side with Jack Kirby on most things, I think there's a tendency or a need somehow with many Kirby advocates that whole and unequivocal creation rights should be granted to one party or the other. No middle ground, no discussion, no room for the creation of a character by two people, which for the record is my opinion in most cases with the original Marvel roster. There is only right and wrong, Lee or Kirby. A is A, right? But even Steve Ditko, who legit, literally saw the world, in a sense, in black and white, things being unquestionably right or wrong, wasn't as staunch or rigid in his view of or demand for co-creation, not singular creation credit. So if a man that was able to shun the public limelight and millions of dollars in the process due to his unwavering and astoundingly rigid moral codes didn't even see things in such a black and white way, I think it's time for an agonizing reappraisal of your view of the situation, maybe. This book falls squarely into the Kirby advocate camp. It paints Lee as a monster, just a credit-swaggling beast for the most part. I grew up with the Lee legacy. I saw his face everywhere, too. I spent years under his spell. I bought into it. I've learned enough now that I know most of what Lee said probably isn't true, but there's a grain of truth there, and really there with Kirby advocates to point out all the little things Lee isn't responsible for while never taking a proper stance on what he did add to the comics. Yes, there was dialogue from Kirby on the pages, but no, Lee never used it in any manner whatsoever, really. Kirby never read a finished Marvel comic. Especially, Kirby never read a finished Marvel comic that he did with Stan Lee. He just didn't. When Lee and Kirby argue, and there's a few instances in this book, Lee points out that I didn't use your dialogue. Did you even read any of those comics? And Kirby comes back with, the action is what mattered anyways. I mean, let's come off of it. Nothing is more important than the other. If anything, the synergy between the two is what was so important. I think that's kind of lost in translation in this book. But just for the historical information presented in here, throughout the Steve Ditko quotes, you're talking about sometimes several $100s for the material from which it's drawn. That being said, written by John Morrow with extensive quotes and interviews, excerpts from the likes of Steve Ditko, Wally Wood, John Romita Sr., Joe Simon, Dick Ayers, Joan Lee, Roz Kirby, Larry Lieber, Jim Shooter, Joe Sinnott, Roy Thomas, John Severin, and that's just in the first 30 pages talking about Kirby and Lee's pre-Marvel work. This book is a wet dream come true for comic book historians like myself. I also feel like I really need to point out that in any instance where Morrow feels like he is, or I thought really he was, implying his own opinion or bits of supposition are offered up on his part, they're marked down with a salt shaker to inform the reader it is his own personal opinion based on the evidence presented, and that they should really be separated sections. While it's a shame someone more impartial wasn't responsible for this book, Morrow deserves a great deal of credit, in my opinion, for not only admitting he is biased, but also evaluating his own writing in as an objective a manner as possible, really befitting the subject matter covered in this book. Now, they talk a lot about and offer insight on all of the early Kirby creations that are usually cited as being the actual ideas Kirby would later present to Stan Lee, which would be tweaked and slightly reworked for the linchpins of the Marvel Universe, like Silver Spider, the character often noted as evolving into Spider-Man, Challengers of the Unknown, who I think it's safe to say are an earlier version of the Fantastic Four, as well as other mainline characters like Night Fighters, The Flying, even showing presentation work, and a list of unused and, as of today, I believe, unpublished mainline characters, titles, and a few finished stories. Now, this information is invaluable, it's hard to track down, and it's really too bad it's written from the point of view of trying to legitimize anything that Kirby said. If Lee speaks over himself with contradiction, Morrow strikes like a rattlesnake, but in the section where Kirby's joining Marvel is discussed, they spend 2 pages trying to show how Kirby might not have been completely lying during 3 interviews in the 80s where he talked about finding Stan Lee crying as the furniture was being hauled out of the Marvel offices. And he comes in and he stops the movers and he's like, have no fear, tell Martin Goodman, I'm going to take over the books and I'll fix everything and yada, yada, yada. It's as much rhetoric as Lee ever spouted himself. I never took it as Kirby lying outright, though. If you know about Marvel, then you know who Joe Manley is. Well, Joe had just passed away when Kirby first came to Marvel. There was literally maybe weeks separating their employment. Not only was Manley the driving force behind anything important or interesting that Marvel was doing that at that time was under the name Atlas, but he was also a close friend of Stan Lee. Manley had lost his glasses and he got drunk with a couple of friends at a business meeting and he fell in between a couple of trains. He was found still clutching his artist portfolio desperately when they found his corpse. I think he had like 3 kids, maybe more, and he left the family in bad financial shape. I had always thought that Kirby was just convalescing to events in his mind. He likely had found Lee in an extremely downtrodden state, perhaps not blubbering as described, but maybe with a fought tear or 2 in his eyes. In his mind, this became Lee emotionally devastated and Kirby entering in his own inimitable heroic style to save the day. John Morrow makes this very argument, and I think he's likely right. But nowhere in this book does he take such ample time as to dispute any of Lee's discrepancies in this manner. Instead, they are used, as likely as they should be, as leverage against Lee's claims and arguments. This same level of argumentation should have been equally applied to the inconsistencies in Kirby's statements and recollections as well, though. That's my opinion. John Morrow exhaustively follows every trail of every conspiracy that you've ever heard about Jack Kirby's input having to do with Spider-Man, no hyphen, Captain America, the Hulk, Fantastic Four, and basically every other character that Marvel came up with. The basic idea is that Kirby liked to reuse ideas. He did it all the time with his own stuff. He pitched that stuff to Lee, who didn't bite, and Kirby then reworked it until Lee was willing to take a chance on it for the most part. If admitting that Kirby took a little too much credit in claiming to be the sole mind behind the creation of Marvel Comics, a little. Yes, Kirby did probably take all of this material to Stan Lee and present it to him at one point or another. Yes, I think that many of the original Marvel creations are spins on Jack Kirby's original creations, but I think they're Stan Lee's ideas applied to Jack Kirby's ideas. The synergistic effects of Stan Lee and Jack Kirby working together were the unique ingredients, not ingredient, that made the Marvel Universe so special and different. The chemistry between the author and illustrator allowed to become so organic by Stan Lee's Marvel method of writing, with conferences, not written plots or scripts, that resulted in some of the greatest comic books ever created. Now, I think that's done. It's very well chronicled throughout this book. There is a wealth of historical information for anybody interested in the subject. I found this book infinitely entertaining, even if a little bit biased. There is absolutely enthralling information about even the most slightly associated information, or things mentioned in happenstance, like Jack Kirby and the Spider-Man creation, and the usage of the Steve Ditko material throughout this book is absolutely wonderful. The only thing that I would say I maybe don't agree with about this book is at the end there is a 15 to 20 page section about Marvel and Jack Kirby's dispute for his original art. I am in fact doing a episode about Steve Ditko and Marvel and their original art, and planning on doing a Jack Kirby and Marvel original art and the theft of said art. But so this is very, very interesting. I really liked reading it, but why are you including that at the end of this book? Stan Lee was not the emperor of Marvel Comics. He was not the be-all, end-all of Marvel Comics. Anybody who knows anything about the history of Marvel knows that. They put that in here because Stan Lee had successfully turned himself into the face of Marvel Comics. And while that usually worked to Stan Lee's advantage, at this point, during this argument, they can use that as a way to punch Stan Lee in the face. And anything that he says throughout this book that's contradictory, you're going to believe is an out-and-out lie. You're much more apt to side with Jack Kirby. It is obviously here to sway you. Although I did enjoy reading it, and it does go up to the Kirby versus Marvel in all the way through his death in 1994, as well as I believe they even touch on the... Oh, no, they don't. No, they don't. They don't have the 2000 lawsuit in here. But at any rate, these guys touch on basically everything of interest relating to this historically. It is absolutely indispensable. I thought it was enthralling. I got it directly from Tomorrow's Publications. It lists for $26.95. I was happy to pay that because I got a PDF version of it, which means I can take this on the go and analyze it. I will, however, include a Amazon link below. Make sure you get the expanded edition, the second edition. The first edition is going for more money at this point, and it is lacking 16 pages, and this also has some minor corrections in it as well. Thanks so much for sticking with me. I really hope you enjoyed. If not, tune in tomorrow. Totally different video about a totally different book. If you did, please hit that like button. If you really enjoyed what you saw, Hulk smash that subscribe button for me. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you keep up with all these crazy books I'm dropping all the time. If you really enjoyed what you saw, think about getting in the comment section below and letting me know. If you have any questions about anything that I talked about or about this book, please get in the comment section below and I will do my best to help you out. Thanks again for sticking with me. As always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things, folks. Keep hitting those local shops and keep reading comics.